When I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time on my own, making music on my two small consumer keyboards. I first had a Casio SK1, and then later on I also had a slightly more modern Technics keyboard. This had a basic sequencer on it, which allowed me to layer up to 5 tracks on top of one another. But the problem was I would often run out of memory, so my tracks were always quite short. I also liked the idea of being able to combine sounds from my Technics and my Casio, and possibly from some other instruments too. A guitar, for example, or our family piano. I did have a small cassette recorder, so I could record my songs, but the quality was pretty terrible. And if I wanted to combine two instruments, the only way to do it was to play them both at once, which was pretty tricky. Sadly, living out in rural South Africa, I had literally no idea that the answer to my problems had existed since the early 80s. The 4-track cassette recorder. The concept is pretty simple. A cassette tape has 2 sets of stereo tracks, running in opposite directions. When you flip the tape over, you are in effect swapping from one set of tracks to the other. With a 4-track recorder, you only run the tape in one direction. But this then gives you 4 separate mono tracks, which you can record to individually. This particular example is a Tascam Porta One. It's a pretty early example of a 4-track cassette machine, dating from about 1984. This was only about 4 years after the first ever 4-track cassette recorder was released by TIAC, Tascam's parent company. I got this one on eBay for a bit of a bargain actually. The listing said the cassette mechanism was jammed, but I think we can probably get it running again, with a bit of love. It's missing the door for the cassette drive, but other than that, it seems to be in fairly reasonable condition, other than a strong smell of stale cigarettes. To be expected from musos in the 80s, I suppose. Let's power it up and give it a quick once-over. All the lights for the VU meters are still working, which is nice to see. Let's try the tape mechanism. I can hear the motor running, but there's no movement from the heads. A broken belt, perhaps? Rewind doesn't work either, but fast forward seems okay. We also have this flashing power light. I'll have to look that up in the manual. So, let's open it up and see if we can see what's going wrong. The belts are pretty old and dry. They're probably the original ones actually. But they are still intact, so this definitely isn't our problem. Let's get the mechanism out. It's a bit difficult to extract because the heads are not fully retracted. They keep catching on the plastic cover. Finally, success. It doesn't look like anything is broken in here, so that's a plus. There is a known issue with these mechanisms where the plastic mounting for the head cracks open, but ours seems to be intact. Right, so after some initial analysis, we can see that the problem is that the tape transport mechanism is not retracting when you press the stop button. It just gets stuck in place. So after a bit of fiddling around, I think I've managed to figure out where the problem is. If you watch this little plastic thing, when I press the play button, it pushes down, and that's what engages the transport. But when I press stop, instead of bouncing back up to the top like it should, it just stays where it is. And that means that the gearing to retract the transport doesn't actually engage. So play is now engaged, and now if we give this a bit of help on the stop, then it actually does retract the way it's supposed to. So I think the reason this is happening is just that the lubrication that was originally in here has all dried up and become sticky, and that has just meant that this whole system just doesn't move as smoothly and efficiently as it should do. So what I'm going to have to do is take all of this out, remove all of these components, clean them all up, and put some new silicone grease on them. The other thing is that if you have old dry belts like this, that's going to result in a lot of wow and flutter on the tape because
As the belt moves around the capstan, there'll be various areas which are slightly more supple than others, and that will result in variations in the tape speed. So I have some new belts on the way. Hopefully they should arrive in a few days. And then I've got to go through the grueling task of dismantling this whole mechanism and cleaning everything. It is, of course, fairly likely that once we get the tape transport working, we might find some other problems in this amplifier board. It's quite likely that some of these capacitors are not good anymore, and some of the faders and stuff might need deoxidizing. But we can't really test any of that until we have the tape deck working. So that's step one, and then we'll see where we're at the end of that.
So, moment of truth. Oh dear. That's not good. It seems we now have a problem with the take-up reel. There's a small rubber tire which rotates against the base of the spindle, and clearly this isn't providing enough torque to spin the take-up reel properly. The tire has probably gone dry, just like the belts. We'll have to try and repair that. Thankfully, the rest of the tape mechanism all seems to be working properly now. The play and record levels do seem a bit out, and the faders and pots are pretty noisy, but we can take a look at that later. I also managed to download a copy of the manual. A lot of it is written in an oddly conversational style, like this bit about recording quality. Pause the video if you want to read it properly. But here in the section about controls, it mentions that the power light will flash when the batteries need replacing. My guess is that because I've been using a 12-volt adapter instead of the maximum 15 volts, it thinks it's running on flat batteries. I ordered a new 15-volt adapter online, but the Porta One, like a lot of electronics from its era, requires a plug with center negative, while most modern power supplies are center positive. So let's do a quick mod to make this adapter compatible. I'm just going to open it up and switch around the connections to the cable, which will reverse the polarity. So now let's tackle that take-up reel problem. First, I'm going to remove the old tire from the idler wheel. Then I'm going to try and replace it with a rubber O-ring of a similar size. I'm not 100% sure this will work, but it's worth a go.
Oh no.
Because the O-ring has a slightly larger diameter, it's still catching on the take-up pulley even when pause is engaged. But I think I can solve this. I'm going to add some heat shrink tubing on the lever which pushes the idler wheel away when pause is pressed. This should be enough to keep it away from the take-up reel. Next, I need to deoxidize all the pots and faders, as they're pretty scratchy. This might also be causing some of the levels to be incorrect. So we need to try and solve this before we do any more calibration. I'm just going to spray some Deoxit contact cleaner into everything and hope for the best. At this point, I spent a bit of time trying to adjust some of the record and playback levels, but I wasn't too happy with how it was sounding. The recordings were coming out a bit uneven, and they sounded a bit thin. But then I tried using a newer Type 1 tape instead of the Type 2 chrome tape I'd previously been using, since the Porta One is supposed to be calibrated specifically for this kind of tape. Surprisingly, the recordings on the Type 1 tape turned out way better, with more consistent levels and a much fuller sound. So I'm going to calibrate the machine using Type 1 tape instead. This is actually an advantage since Type 2 tape is harder to find now, and consequently way more expensive. Type 1 tape, on the other hand, can still be bought new, like this Fox C60, which is actually really good. So first I'm going to make a calibration tape using my Yamaha tape deck. I can trust this deck to make good quality recordings with accurate levels. First I'll record some white noise with the levels at 0 dB. I'll record one side and then flip the tape over and record the same length again on the other side, giving us white noise on all 4 tracks. Next, I'll do the same with a test piece of music. I'll first record it in mono on one side, and then reverse the music and record it again on the other side. When I play this in the 4-track, I'll be able to hear the same identical music on all 4 channels. Now I can use my calibration tape to set the levels on the Porta One. First, I'll use the music to adjust the head azimuth, checking that it sounds consistent on all 4 tracks. Then I'll set the playback levels on each track using the 0 dB white noise and the recorded music. I can use the music to flip between different tracks and check that the sound is consistent. Once the playback levels are correct, I can now set the record levels. I'll record a section of music on each track and then check that it plays back at a similar level, since I know the playback levels are already right. The final result isn't perfect. For some reason, track 2 is a bit muddier than the rest, and the record levels seem to vary a little from recording to recording. Probably some of the capacitors are getting a bit tired. But I think this will do. After all, if I wanted a perfect recording, I could just use my DAW. So, let's put it to work and make ourselves a multi-track recording. The Porta One features a noise reduction system called dBx. Essentially, this is a compression algorithm which boosts the levels of quiet parts when recording, and then reduces them again on playback, effectively reducing the noise floor with them. It definitely helps with tape hiss, which is a significant issue when you have 4 tracks playing at the same time. So I'm going to turn it on. It does introduce some artifacts to the recording, but they are quite subtle, so they shouldn't be obvious in the final mix. I'm also going to set the tape speed to maximum. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, a higher tape speed gives a higher maximum frequency response. And secondly, since tape hiss is much more apparent at lower speeds, speeding it up as much as possible should help to reduce this a bit. First, let's lay down a rhythm and bass combo on track 1. Adding them both to one track leaves the others free, and also means that I can add some sidechain compression to the bass, so it doesn't fight with the kick drum. First, I'll make a drum loop on my Electron model samples. Now I'll make a bass loop in Ableton. I've set up the rig with the outputs running into tracks 1 and 2 of the Porta Studio, which will be summed to a mono track. As I'm recording this in, I'll add some extra effects and risers as well. Next, let's add a piano accompaniment on track 3. This contains a lot of quick, short notes, so I want to quantize it to keep it neat. But this introduces a bit of a challenge, since when I play back the quantized loop, it will tend to drift out of time with the tape. We also have to make sure that when the part comes in, it's exactly in time with the rest of the music. So I'll start it earlier than needed and use Ableton's nudge feature to align it to the recorded music. If it starts to drift later, I can just nudge it back into time in the same way. For some reason, the Q levels are very low compared to the record monitoring, so I have to play in the new part really loudly compared to the recording. Now we can go back and record silence over the first part of the recording where I was getting the part into time. I'll stop the recording just before the part is supposed to come in. Cool, so far so good. But there wouldn't be much point in recording all 4 tracks from the same rig. So for the remaining 2 tracks, I'm going to hook up my Casio SK1. This is exactly how I would have envisioned using a 4-track as a kid, overdubbing separate parts using different instruments. In this case, I'm also going to add a reverb delay pedal to stop the SK1 from sounding too dry. As I mentioned earlier, for some reason, recordings on track 2 of the Porta Studio play back a bit more muffled than the other tracks. So to try and counteract this, let's reduce the tape speed as far as possible to record the track, and then speed it up again afterwards. First, I need to adjust the tape speed so it's properly in tune. Now let's record the part, playing it in a lower key. Since the SK1 is quite noisy, I'm keeping the fader down until the part starts, and dropping it back down again afterwards. Now we can speed the tape back up again. For the final track, I'm going to use the brass ensemble patch on the SK1 to help fill out some of the chorus sections. Set the levels, record the part, easy peasy lemon squeezy. Finally, I need to spend some time mixing all the tracks to get them sounding balanced and adding some EQ and panning. So here's our finished track. What you're about to hear is the direct output from the Porta One with no added processing. I have to say, I think it sounds pretty decent. Apart from a bit of pleasant tape saturation, I think you would struggle to tell that this was recorded on a 40-year-old 4-track cassette machine. Enjoy, and I'll see you again soon. And if you've made it this far, maybe consider subscribing so we can enjoy more random adventures together.